The morning of November 6, 1956, dawned over Port Said with the deceptive clarity of total victory. From a military standpoint, it was a masterclass in imperial power projection. The sky above the Suez Canal was choked with the thunder of French Nord-Atlas transports and British Valetas. On the ground, the Royal Marines of 42 Commando were advancing with clinical precision, their boots crunching over the debris of a decimated Egyptian resistance. The Egyptian Air Force had been effectively erased. General Nasser's army was in full retreat. To the commanders looking through their binoculars on the bridge of the carrier HMS Eagle, the road to Cairo lay wide open. The operation, codenamed Musketeer, was technically a triumph. The lion had roared, and the colony had trembled. Yet, 3,000 miles away, inside the suffocating smoke-filled cabinet room at 10 Downing Street, the British Empire was dying. Not with a bang, but with a ledger entry. Prime Minister Anthony Eden, gaunt, feverish, and fueled by a cocktail of Benzedrine to combat his failing health, sat staring at a piece of paper that weighed more than all the tanks in Egypt. It wasn't a battlefield report. It was a memo from Harold Macmillan, the Chancellor of the Exchequer. While British paratroopers were securing physical assets in the Middle East, a far more lethal war was being waged on the trading floors of New York. The Federal Reserve, under the quiet direction of the Eisenhower administration, was systematically dumping the pound sterling. The sell-off was aggressive, relentless, and surgically precise. Macmillan, his face ashen, delivered the coup de grace to the assembled cabinet. The Bank of England's gold and dollar reserves were hemorrhaging at a rate of 15% in mere days. They had hit the psychological floor of $2 billion. Below this line lay not just a recession, but a national default, a humiliation that would turn the Great Britain of Churchill into a bankrupt island nation. "We need a loan," Macmillan stated flatly. "We need the IMF to bail us out immediately." But the trap had already snapped shut. When Britain reached out to the International Monetary Fund, an institution they had helped design just a decade prior, they found the phone line dead. The United States had blocked the withdrawal. The message from Washington was brutal in its simplicity, a financial ultimatum that no amount of gunboat diplomacy could counter. Order a ceasefire by midnight, or we crash your currency. This was the paradox of Suez. On the map, the British and French flags were marching forward. In the ledger, they were already in receivership. Eden, the man who viewed Nasser as a new Hitler and compromise as appeasement, realized he was holding a gun with no bullets. He could conquer Egypt, but he couldn't pay for the oil to fuel his ships home. He had prepared for a 19th century colonial war, only to be ambushed by a 20th century financial execution. That evening, humiliatingly, Eden picked up the phone and ordered the ceasefire. The soldiers on the ground, undefeated and confused, stopped in their tracks. They hadn't lost to the Egyptians. They had been defeated by the dollar. Suez was not a military failure. It was a margin call on the British Empire. It was the precise historical moment when the world realized that the true currency of global hegemony was no longer gunpowder. It was credit. To understand the sudden collapse of the British Empire, one must first look past the maps of the Middle East and into the fevered mind of its prime minister. Anthony Eden was a man physically and mentally disintegrating in real time. Plagued by a botched bile duct surgery, he was governing Britain through a haze of high fevers, amphetamines to wake up, and barbiturates to sleep. But his most dangerous affliction was not medical. It was historical. Eden was a man trapped in the 1930s. He had watched the policy of appeasement fail against Hitler, and he had vowed never to repeat it. When Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Eden did not see an Egyptian nationalist reclaiming a waterway. He saw Benito Mussolini on the Nile. For Eden, this was not a dispute over logistics or tonnage fees. It was a morality play. He believed that if he did not crush Nasser now, Britain would cease to be a great power. It was a delusion born of vanity and trauma. Across the Channel, the French were driven by a far more visceral desperation. For Prime Minister Guy Mollet, Suez was not about prestige, it was about survival. France was bleeding out in the mountains of Algeria, fighting a brutal anti-colonial war. They were convinced that Nasser was the puppet master, the man feeding weapons and ideology to the Algerian rebels. The French logic was cold and sharp. Cut off the head of the snake in Cairo, and the rebellion in Algiers would wither. They were the architects of the collusion, dragging a hesitant Britain into a secret pact that felt less like diplomacy and more like a mafia conspiracy. But while London and Paris were playing a 19th century colonial game, Washington was playing 4D chess. Dwight D. Eisenhower sat in the Oval Office, staring at a calendar that highlighted a single date, November 6th, Election Day. The timing of the Anglo-French invasion could not have been worse. Eisenhower was furious. He felt personally betrayed by his W-1 allies who had kept him in the dark. More importantly, he was looking at the bigger board. Soviet tanks were rolling into Budapest to crush the Hungarian Revolution. Eisenhower knew he could not condemn Soviet aggression in Eastern Europe while simultaneously supporting Western aggression in the Middle East. To win the Cold War, America had to appear as the champion of anti-colonialism. Eisenhower made a cold calculation. He would sacrifice his oldest allies to secure America's moral high ground with the developing world. Beneath the pomp of the Royal Navy lay a financial structure so rotten it could barely hold its own weight. The British economy was a hollow shell, masking a mountain of war debt owed largely to the United States. The pound sterling was the pivot point. Britain was desperate to maintain the exchange rate at $2.8. This was not just a number. It was the psychological anchor of the sterling area, a trading bloc of nations that held their reserves in London. If the value of the pound collapsed, the sterling area would disintegrate, and the City of London would lose its status as a global financial hub. The British Treasury was essentially bluffing a poker hand with an empty wallet. They had gold reserves, yes, but they were dangerously low. They were fighting a war on the assumption that the markets would stay calm. They failed to realize that the markets were watching, and the man controlling the market sentiment was the very president they had just betrayed. The board was set not for a military victory, but for a financial ambush. The British had brought battleships to a currency war. The transaction began not with a handshake, but with a sinking ship. As British and French paratroopers secured the canal banks, Nasser played his own trump card. He didn't need to defeat the Royal Navy. He only needed to obstruct them. On his orders, 47 ships, filled with rocks and cement, were scuttled in the Suez Canal. The world's most vital commercial artery was instantly severed. In London and Paris, the geopolitical calculations shifted violently from conquest to survival. The blockage meant that 2/3 of Europe's oil supply was choked off. The tankers from the Persian Gulf could no longer pass. Winter was coming, factories were facing shutdowns, and cars were queuing for rationing. This was the moment the United States activated the mechanism of transfer. The chessboard was cleared, and the auction block was brought out. The only alternative source of oil substantial enough to rescue Europe lay in the Western Hemisphere. specifically in the oil fields of Texas and Venezuela, controlled by American giants. The Eisenhower administration held the tap. Under normal alliance protocols, the U.S. would have activated the Middle East Emergency Committee to reroute tankers to their distressed allies. But when British officials called Washington, the line was cold. President Eisenhower's instruction to his aides was ruthless and explicitly transactional. Let them boil in their own oil. He made it clear that not a single gallon of American fuel would cross the Atlantic until the British committed to a humiliating, unconditional withdrawal. The price of energy was political submission. Simultaneously, the second jaw of the trap slammed shut: the financial squeeze. While the British Treasury was frantically burning through its gold reserves to buy its own currency and prop up the $2.80 exchange rate, they realized they were fighting a rigged game. The selling pressure on the pound wasn't just nervous market sentiment, it was being orchestrated. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York was quietly selling sterling, driving the price down faster than the Bank of England could prop it up. It was a financial siege. Desperate, Chancellor Macmillan reached for the lifeline: the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Britain was a founding member of the IMF. Technically, they had the right to withdraw their own quota, a tranche of $561 million that would have stabilized the pound instantly. It was their money, meant for exactly this kind of balance of payments crisis. But the mechanism of global finance had new owners. When the British request landed, U.S. Treasury Secretary George Humphrey simply forbade the transaction. He effectively told the IMF, "Do not release the funds. This was the predatory contract in its purest form." The U.S. weaponized the very institutions built to ensure global stability, turning the IMF into an instrument of coercion. The terms of the deal were laid out in black and white. The loan would be paid only when the British accepted the ceasefire. It was a foreclosure. Britain was forced to trade its geopolitical autonomy for short-term solvency. The hidden cost was devastatingly high. By accepting the American terms, Britain was not just buying oil and dollars. They were handing over the keys to the Middle East. They were trading their independent right of action, the hallmark of a sovereign great power, for a credit line. The hard assets of oil and gold were the leverage, but the true commodity being transferred was the future. In those frantic days of November, the British government realized they had built a nuclear-armed military, but forgot to build the financial independence to use it. They had the bomb, but they had to ask permission to pay for the gas. The transaction was complete. The empire hadn't just been defeated, it had been bought out in a hostile takeover. The ceasefire of November 7th stopped the shooting, but it did not stop the bleeding. As the smoke cleared over the canal, the British elite woke up to a terrifying realization. They hadn't just lost a battle. They had been lured into a structural prison from which there was no escape. The genius of the American strategy lay not in the immediate checkmate, but in the redesign of the board itself. The crisis exposed a fatal flaw in the architecture of the British economy, a trapdoor that Washington could open at will. This trapdoor was the sterling balances. For decades, Britain had financed its wars and its empire by essentially borrowing from its own colonies. Nations like India, Pakistan, Malaysia, and even Egypt held billions of pounds in London banks. These were IOUs of the empire. As long as these nations kept their money in London and traded in sterling, the system worked. But the moment confidence shook, these creditors would rush to the exit, exchanging their crashing pounds for hard US dollars. During the crisis, The U.S. Treasury didn't just passively watch this happen. They weaponized it. They signaled to the global markets that the pound was unsafe. This created a structural vulnerability. Britain was a bank with too many depositors demanding their cash at once. The trap tightened when Harold Macmillan, the man who had transitioned from hawk to dove overnight, realized the condition of the American rescue. The U.S. agreed to support the 2.80 exchange rate, but the price was the dismantling of the sterling area, the closed economic bloc that gave Britain its global weight. Washington's message was clear. We will save your currency, but you must play by our rules. The new rules were designed to ensure that London could never again act independently. The structural trap was the dollar standard. By forcing Britain to rely on U.S. loans to defend the pound, America effectively placed a veto power over the British budget. If the British government wanted to spend money on a military expedition, a social program, or a new weapons system, they now had to silently ask, will this upset the holders of our debt in Washington? The special relationship was reforged into a golden set of handcuffs. Britain was allowed to keep the trappings of a great power, the nuclear weapons, the UN Security Council seat, the pomp and ceremony. But the engine room was now remote-controlled from across the Atlantic. The trap was psychological as much as it was financial. The Suez Crisis shattered the imperial preference mindset. British leaders realized that their economy was too small to support their geopolitical ambitions. They were trapped in a cycle. To maintain their global standing, they needed a strong pound. To keep a strong pound, they needed American backing. To get American backing, they had to align their foreign policy with U.S. interests. This structural reality forced a painful pivot. It was here, in the ashes of Suez, that the seeds of the European Union were inadvertently watered. Realizing they could no longer rely on the Commonwealth or compete with the U.S. alone, British strategists began to look desperately toward the European continent. They sought a new structure to shelter them from the cold winds of the dollar. But the damage was done. The mechanism of 1956 had successfully stripped the great from Britain. The U.S. had engineered a system where the former master was now a junior partner, permanently leveraged, permanently monitored, and permanently bound by the invisible wires of international finance. The empire didn't end on the battlefield. It ended in the fine print of a balance sheet that could no longer be balanced. The financial garrote had done its work. Now came the asphyxiation of the political soul. In the weeks following the ceasefire, a strange and melancholy silence descended upon London. The initial adrenaline of the crisis, the furious telegrams, the midnight cabinet meetings, the maps of the canal, evaporated, leaving behind the cold ash of humiliation. The collapse was no longer a matter of currency reserves. It was now a collapse of the national psyche. The first domino to fall was the physical embodiment of the crisis. Anthony Eden. The Prime Minister was a broken man. The strain of the deception, combined with the brutality of the American betrayal, had shattered his fragile health. On November 23rd, just weeks after the operation began, Eden did something that symbolized the utter exhaustion of the British Empire. He fled. He flew to Jamaica to recuperate, seeking refuge at Goldeneye, the private estate of Ian Fleming. There is a supreme historical irony in this image. While the creator of James Bond was typing out fantasies of a British agent who could save the world with a Walther PPK and a license to kill, the real Prime Minister was resting in the next room, living proof that Britain could no longer even save itself. The fantasy of omnipotence was being written on paper, while the reality of impotence was sleeping in the guest bedroom. Back in London, the power Vacuum was filled by the very man who had sounded the alarm, Harold Macmillan. The Chancellor, who had been the first in, first out, hawkish on the invasion until the dollar reserves tanked, now maneuvered to take the crown. He understood what Eden could not accept. The era of independent action was dead. The shock hit the public when the physical withdrawal began. Under immense pressure from the UN and the US, Anglo-French troops began to evacuate Port Said in December. The newsreels showed a sight that the British public had not processed in centuries. Their boys, undefeated in battle, packing up and leaving because a foreign power told them to. The angry, jeering crowds of Egyptians lining the harbor were not just mocking the soldiers. They were mocking the ghost of the Victorian age. For the French, the collapse turned into bitterness. They felt betrayed by perfidious Albion. When Britain capitulated to the American financial pressure without consulting Paris, the trust between the two nations evaporated. The French learned a harsh lesson. Britain would always choose the Atlantic over the continent. This betrayal planted the deep seeds of Gaullism, the determination that France must build its own independent nuclear deterrent and European power bloc, free from the whims of London or Washington. The final act of the collapse came on January 9, 1957. Anthony Eden returned from Jamaica, bronzed by the sun but politically necrotic. His doctors told him his life was at risk if he continued. His cabinet told him his leadership was untenable. He went to Sandringham House to offer his resignation to Queen Elizabeth II. When Eden walked out of the palace, he was not just a resigning prime minister. He was the last prime minister to believe that Britain was a superpower. His departure marked the Girolamo Savonarola moment of the British Empire, the burning of the vanities. The shockwave rippled through the establishment. The Suez syndrome took hold, a pervasive national lack of confidence that would plague British foreign policy for decades. The collapse was total. It wasn't just a government that fell, it was a world view. The illusion that a small island off the coast of Europe could command the tides of history was finally, painfully, dispelled. The Americans had not just fired a warning shot, they had evicted the old landlord. As Macmillan stepped into Downing Street, he knew his job was not to rule the waves, but to manage the decline. When the dust settled over the Sinai and the last British ship vanished over the horizon, history sat down to conduct the final audit. The ledger of 1956 revealed a result far more profound than a failed invasion. It was the closing of a century-long business cycle. In the decades that followed, the true cost of Suez became clear. It wasn't paid in the currency of lost ships or fallen soldiers, but in the diverging destinies of the great powers. For Britain, Suez was the psychological moment of truth. The illusion of imperial autonomy was shattered. Harold Macmillan, the man who picked up the pieces, formulated a new strategy. If Britain could no longer be Rome, it would be the Greeks to the American Romans, the wise counselor whispering in the ear of the brute emperor. Britain accepted its new role as the permanent junior partner, tethering its military, intelligence, and foreign policy to Washington. The special relationship survived, but the terms had changed forever. It was no longer a partnership of equals. It was a relationship of dependency. France, however, read the balance sheet differently. Where Britain saw the need for submission, France saw the necessity of defiance. Bitterly resentful of the American betrayal and British capitulation, Paris concluded that they could never trust the Anglo-Saxon powers again. This bitterness gave birth to the fiercely independent foreign policy of Charles de Gaulle. France accelerated its own nuclear program, the Force de Frappe, and turned its energy toward organizing Europe into a power bloc that could stand apart from the dollar. The seeds of the modern European Union and its friction with the U.S. were sown in the humiliations of 1956. For the United States, the victory was absolute, but the prize was complicated. By humiliating Britain and France, Eisenhower had effectively evicted the old colonial landlords from the Middle East. But in doing so, the U.S. inherited the lease. America was now the sole guarantor of security in the region. The burden of policing the Gulf, securing the oil, and managing the volatility of Arab nationalism shifted entirely to Washington. The road from Suez led directly to the Eisenhower Doctrine, and eventually to the entanglements of Iraq and the modern geopolitical quagmires of the region. America bought the title deed to the world, but the maintenance costs would prove astronomical. Yet, the undisputed victor of 1956 was an inanimate object: the U.S. dollar. Suez proved once and for all that in the modern era, financial sovereignty trumps military capability. It established the dollar standard as the ultimate weapon of mass destruction. A nation could have aircraft carriers, paratroopers, and nuclear technology, but if it did not control its own currency reserves, it was powerless. The golden handcuffs that clamped onto Britain became the governing dynamic of the Cold War and the globalized economy that followed. The enduring lesson of the Suez Crisis is a meditation on the nature of power itself. Anthony Eden believed power was kinetic, measured in battalions, battleships, and territory. He was fighting a 19th century war in a 20th century world. Dwight Eisenhower understood that power was potential, measured in credit lines, energy flows, and market confidence. If we look back at the crisis through the lens of history, we see a stark warning for any modern nation. There is no such thing as political independence without financial independence. The British Empire did not fall because it was outfought. It fell because it ran out of liquidity. In the end, the empire wasn't conquered. It was foreclosed. The world had moved from the age of gunboat diplomacy to the age of dollar diplomacy. And in that new world, the banker always holds the highest rank. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the times. Because when history is written, you'll want to be among the few who recognized what was coming early. Thank you for watching and being part of the journey.